Hey there, Vince here, and welcome to a very staticky circuit rewind. Sega! So I like to collect a lot of weird, random, esoteric pieces of hardware. And in front of me today, I have the Sega Game Gear television tuner. And as you can see, we're watching some pretty fine television right now. Maybe. The reason for that, let's cover the elephant in the room. Over-the-air broadcast television no longer exists in the analog form that this used here in the United States. So VHF, UHF analog broadcast no longer exists here. We now have digital over-the-air television, but this predates that by a couple decades. So what can we get out of this? A whole lot of static. Not much else. So I guess that's the whole video. So if this thing can't be used here in 2023, why do I want to talk about this then? There's this constant discussion back and forth on the internet whether emulation is the right way to do historical preservation. And to a certain extent, it can, but it also can't. Usually when people talk about emulation, they think about playing Super Mario Brothers on a Windows computer. But that only tells part of the story. That doesn't give you the real true experience as it was felt in that era. And that's especially true when you start looking at third-party add-ons for consoles or handhelds, or in this case, like the Game Gear TV adapter. Sadly, in my case, I actually don't have a Game Gear in my collection right now. What I do have is the analog Mega SG with the Game Gear adapter for it, which allows me to plug this in. And you may notice that I have the Mega SG turned around backwards to be able to see the TV tuner. But if you think about it on a handheld system, when you slot the cartridge in on those systems, the label and face of that cartridge faces away from you. Versus on a normal game console, like the Genesis, the Mega Drive, Super Nintendo, things like that, the label would be facing you. So it makes sense that with this arrangement that the TV tuner would be facing away from me. As this stands right here, this has no practical value here in 2023. It just doesn't. There's no TV signals for it to tap into. But that doesn't make it entirely worthless, and I'm going to show something here in a second. But I want to talk a little bit about what this was in the era that it came out first. Kids today, chances are the adults have bought them a cheap cell phone. That way they have connectivity, with their parents. They can watch YouTube videos, things like that. When I was a kid, that didn't exist. YouTube wasn't invented yet. Most of what we think of as the internet did not exist yet. And going back in time, if you think of the early 2000s, there were like little Pokemon video cartridges for the Game Boy Advance to watch video on the go, like when you're sitting in the back of a van on a long road trip. This predates that by about a decade. So this, instead of the early 2000s, this goes all the way back into the early to mid 1990s. And this would give you the ability, granted on a Game Gear that had notoriously terrible battery life, the ability to watch television while on the road, on the go. So if you're driving from, let's say in my area, Seattle to Portland, a 3-hour drive, this would give you the ability to watch TV maybe half of the way there. Again, the Game Gear had terrible battery life. It was notorious for that. But this was still better than nothing. You may think like, oh, back in the day, people had little flip phones at least for entertainment. No, this predates basically anybody other than the ultra wealthy having a cell phone. And when we're talking cell phone, we're talking those big, honking, clunky things that didn't even have screens. So this was a neat little way to get portable television to a kid for a little bit of entertainment value that otherwise wasn't available. When we think of like portable screens today, portable LCDs, things like that, like what's on a cell phone or a tablet or something like that, having a portable screen other than like these few game consoles like the Game Gear and the Game Boy, otherwise were mostly unheard of. Back then, a portable screen was a miniature CRT that was literally a foot deep for the entire unit. And those things just were not practical, really, to just sit on your lap and watch television in the back of a car. So this was actually kind of cool back in the day. Again, I don't have a Game Gear now. I've never owned a Game Gear, so this was not a luxury I had up until a couple months ago when I purchased this, just to play around with it. So, speaking of playing around with it, is there anything we can do with it today? So what I have here, another item from my collection, the Sharp Famicom Twin, which combines a Famicom with a Famicom disk system. And for today, I don't have any disk system games with me. I'm just going to use the normal Famicom cartridge slot on this. But this console had one extra feature that a normal Famicom didn't, besides the disk drive. The TV tuner here also supports composite video input. So I'm going to take this cable here, plug it in, and instantly the screen goes dark with some fuzzy noise because this is not a good analog to digital conversion, mind you. And now I'm going to turn on the Sharp Famicom Twin, and we have Mario and Barbie Land. Look how pink it is. So the first time I hooked this up, this is exactly what I saw. Since then, that was a couple days ago, and I've been playing with this a bit and getting it figured out. And I was scratching my head thinking maybe something was horribly wrong with this TV tuner. And it dawned on me how old televisions from this era and earlier worked to actually produce the color signal. In composite video, there's actually a black and white signal being sent, and then there's a second signal that says what the color information should be to colorize those pixels. It was a backwards compatibility system for really, really old black and white televisions. And down in the link below, I'll link to a playlist from Technology Connections that talks all about this if you want to spend the next 4 hours learning how old analog television and NTSC signaling work. Anyway, so yeah, this is what I got, and I realized, from remembering those videos and my own experience, the color information on modern televisions, modern televisions do a great job of auto-calibrating that. However, on old systems like this, terrible at that. Or this one in particular didn't have an automated calibration system for the color at all. It was completely manually driven, and I completely spaced on that when I first took this up. And so I was looking around trying to figure out what's going on. I was going to take it apart, and then I realized there's this really tough to turn wheel here on the side. And as I turn it, got to get my thumbnail all the way in there. Like I said, it's not easy. On turn, a little bit too far there. This is called the tint, which changes the hue of the signal. And now we're fairly close to what it was originally. I'm not going to spend the time to do pixel peeping to make sure that it's accurate to what it was. But old tube televisions, really old ones, would also have a color hue or a tint adjustment, which did the exact same thing that I just did here. Versus modern ones will kind of auto-detect and figure that out on their own. So with that, that's player 2. I need player 1. I can sit here and actually play Mario World through basically a Genesis, or rather a Game Gear. That's hooked up to a Genesis. Video quality is absolutely atrocious. It's very noisy. The screen resolution, I think, is 160 by 144 for the Game Gear. So much lower than what these other systems would have, and it shows by having everything just being a blurry mess here. Like, especially if you look at the line of the flagpole there, you can see it flickering in and out, especially the blocks on the bottom are flickering in and out a bunch. The text is basically illegible. Oh look, I got fireworks, that's cool. I wasn't even trying for that, that wasn't intentional. Yeah, let's pause there. And just like even where it's supposed to be a solid color blue, there's so much fuzz in this. It is just a really, really bad signal because, again, this is a very old analog to digital converter sitting inside of this adapter here. But again, think of the era 30 years ago, being a kid and being able to watch a movie like on the go, watch TV on the go. Or like using this specific cable here, why would that even exist? Well, with this, you can plug it into your VCR and lay in bed, and that way you can have like a tiny little screen with the covers over you, And just imagine being like a 6, 7-year-old kid being able to watch a movie like that, like we do today with cell phones, but doing it all the way back then. It was more special back then because it was unique, and not everybody can do it. Only people that had a specialized setup could do it, albeit with a little tether wire going back to your VCR. Like, that was cool. That was awesome. And those are the kinds of experiences that we're missing with emulation today. Is it this kind of a setup something I think everybody should be doing today? No. But this gives an idea of like, emulation isn't perfect. Emulation doesn't cover every use case of history. So while we're trying to preserve history with emulation, physical hardware is also very, very much important in the preservation and conservation of, the history of video games as a whole, the history of technology as a whole. Which is exactly why I brought out the Sharp Famicom Twin to do this specifically versus some modern device that can output a composite video signal. Because again, like this device here shows even Nintendo's own progression, going from purely RF signaling over to composite video signaling. This right here, like what I described, being able to lay in bed and hook this up to a VCR, is literally the precursor to a cell phone watching YouTube. I'm just going to sit here and play around with this for a little bit more. I'm at a terrible angle to actually watch what I'm doing, but hell, it's Mario, I don't care. Nope, I did not outrun him. I'm dead. So with that, I think it's game over. I don't know, the pixels are a little hard to read there. Yeah, I just wanted to showcase a little bit of the history of physical hardware, and I have a lot more sitting behind me and around my whole home here. I have countless pieces of old hardware, so if there's any piece you want to see covered, whether I own it or not, let me know down below, because I do have a lot of hardware myself. I have access to a lot of other people's hardware I can do little mini reviews on like this, and just talk about and showcase the history of, what my childhood was like, what video games were like in that era. So until next time, like I said, just leave me a comment and let me know what you think. Toodaloos!